thank you all so much for joining us for an evening for people who love animals. Authors Melanie Kaplan, the author of Lab Dog, A Beagle and His Human, investigate the surprising world of animal research, as well as E.B. Bartels, Good Grief on Loving Pets Here and Hereafter. We'll discuss their new books on important topics of interest to pet owners and animal lovers. And I'm going to keep this brief. So Melanie is a longtime independent journalist whose travel and science writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, a rough day for The Washington Post today, The Wall Street Journal, and National Parks Magazine. Let's see here. Meanwhile, EB, I'll get to you, is a nonfiction writer, a teacher, an editor, and a former bookseller with an MFA from Columbia. Her essays and interviews have appeared in Salon, Slate, WBUR, Literary Hub, and Catapult, among others. I again want to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring all our programs. So all nearly 100 of us who eventually will be watching live, and the hundreds more that will watch the recording. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to EB and Melanie for joining us here tonight. And folks, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Oh,
Thank you, Robert.
that was great. That was what a great hype man. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And I'm so excited to chat with Melanie about her new book, which just came out in the fall. So we figured we'd start with talking first about Lab Dog a bit, then maybe about Good Grief a little bit, and then some things that both our books have in common. So Melanie, I loved Lab Dog, as you know, otherwise I, wouldn't be doing this conversation with you. And I guess, can you just start by saying, for everyone, what drew you to writing about this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for setting this up, and thanks, Robert, for hosting. This is really fun to be here together. I adopted a beagle named Hammy in 2013, and he wasn't the first beagle I had in my life, but I knew that he was a little special. He came from a laboratory in Virginia, and that's all I knew about him. Is the first 3+ years of his life were spent in a lab. And for many years, I would introduce him to people, and he had a blue tattoo in his ear. This is how beagles bred for research are identified, with a tattoo. And, I would say he was in a lab, and people would say, "Oh my God, I had no idea that we were using dogs for research or testing." People asked me if it was still legal, and I said yes, but I really didn't have answers to a lot of those questions. So being a journalist, I put on my journalist hat about 5 years ago and set off to answer some questions about Hammy's background and why and what of dog research.
Yeah, I really loved the book. In some ways reads almost like a buddy comedy detective novel, because it's, you and Hammy going on this often road trip, driving all around to these different places. Um And I love sort of like the mystery element too, because I was somebody who, like, when I think of animal testing, I think of mice, I didn't really think about dogs. And in particular, can you explain a bit, why are beagles often the go-to breed of dog that's used for testing?
Yeah, beagles are the vast majority of the dogs. And, often I would hear, well, it's because they're docile and friendly. And we all know beagles are easy size to pick up. They're very food motivated, but they don't eat as much as, for example, a Great Dane. So they're probably cheaper to keep in a lab, and, smaller quarters for them. But in my research, I also learned that there was a whole system of breeding beagles in place. The beagles came to this country after the Civil War because people used them to hunt rabbits. It was actually a sport called beagling. And so these kennels were breeding beagles to hunt, and they were always trying to breed a healthier beagle and a disease-free beagle. And so when it was time for the Atomic Energy Commission to test radioactive substances on somebody that wasn't humans, they went to these beagles. And then the pharmaceutical companies went to these beagles. So the infrastructure was already in place with these beagle kennels. And I think it was a pretty easy pivot at that point.
That makes a lot of sense. Though I feel like a lot of people when they think of beagles, they just think of Snoopy. Um,
Yeah, well, Snoopy was part of the reason I think that beagles were the number one breed in the US in the 50s. And yeah, everybody loves beagles. And so it's surprising to a lot of people that this is kind of the poster breed for animal research for dogs.
And I wanted to ask too, because I know that at some of your events, you often have Beagle audience members who are also lab beagles like Hammy. And I was wondering, is there like a community that you have found of fellow rescued lab dog owners?
Yeah, some of my good friends were adopters of these lab dogs when I was. So Hammy got out of the lab, and there were six other beagles, and they all were named after founding fathers. So he's actually Alexander Hamilton. And then we were really good friends with George Washington and his mom. They lived in North Carolina, and James Madison, who became Maddie because that was a girl. So Maddie and her mom lived in Buffalo. So we really got to be good friends with them. And to be honest, at the beginning, we were all talking about like how we were coping with these dogs. They were really afraid of everything. Hammy just trembled a lot. Every sound was new to him. He'd see a reflection in the sliding glass door, and that scared him. So we would get on the phone and talk about, well, like, how's Maddie doing? How's George doing? And George didn't walk through a doorway for over a year. His mom had to like pick him up and carry him over the threshold. And so these dogs had a lot of fears, and living in confinement can be traumatizing for sure for any kind of animal.
Yeah. Well, I love that you had each other to kind of, bounce things off of and find that support. Um, but I guess so going back to sort of your whole, research journey with Hammy for researching this book, um, I guess I'm interested to know sort of what were your maybe preconceived notions going into it, or your assumptions maybe you had about the industry, and were there things that surprised you that you learned, or did your thinking change in any way over the course of your research and writing the book?
There were so many surprises. I mean, I went into it knowing very little. I had kind of heard from both sides. Like you hear from animal activists sometimes that these are bad people working in the labs or they're doing monstrous things. And then you hear from the research community that we have to do this research on animals and human medicine and our lives depend on it. And I was certain that there was a whole big place in the middle that was not on these far sides. And as a journalist, I wanted to kind of learn from all the different players. I mean, there's so many stakeholders. You have the research people, you've got ethicists, you have veterinarians who work in the labs, you've got lawmakers who learn about these, research programs and sometimes try to introduce bills to make lives better for the animals. So, there's a lot of different players, and I really wanted to hear from everybody. I think, I was definitely surprised by some of the experiments I learned about. It was hard research at some points, but I think that what surprised me the most about the animals that were in labs is that even in the best conditions, they're still being confined. They still can't do what animals like to do. I mean, Hammy couldn't sniff out new things. I mean, I don't know what his lab situation looked like, but he was in the same place every day. He couldn't decide whether he wanted to sleep, on the couch or on the bed or in a different room. And living in confinement is not a great way to live for any animal. So I think that was really surprising. And I just really tried to be open and hear everyone's side of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated that about your book, and I loved how you really, I feel like, wrote into the gray area because it's not a black and white issue, and there are things that have come from animal research that have saved people's lives, but then also you read about some of the conditions that these, lab animals are in, and it's horrific. So I really appreciated how many different people you spoke to for the book. And I, in addition to sort of the nuance and sort of looking for, multiple perspectives, were there other sort of major themes or I guess takeaways that you feel like are important for readers to notice when they're going into reading your book?
I was struck by how pervasive animal research and testing is. So, I think that when we start thinking about it, we're like, oh, this is, so we can get new drugs. But dog testing, for example, is required for every pesticide on the market. So that means the pesticides that are used in big agricultural, um, programs, or the bug spray that you get at home, or the ant killer that you put under your cabinets. I mean, every single pesticide that is designed to kill something is tested on dogs for 90 days. And, all sorts of chemicals are tested on animals. There's the more I looked, the more I realized like it's everywhere. Animal testing is all over the place. So, I really tried to think about when I bought something, okay, do I need to buy this over-the-counter drug? Um, I really would think about Hammy every time it was a purchase. I started looking more at buying cruelty-free, shampoo and conditioner and soap. Um, so I think that, the book kind of covers the history of dog research, where we are today with drug testing and chemical testing, using animals and dogs specifically for education, but also how this is changing and how we're starting to replace animals with some other methods of testing, which leaves me optimistic.
Yeah, I would say I definitely like it wasn't like a doom and gloom book at all. Like I was really amazed by some of the technology you write about. And I mean everyone should read this book because it was mind-blowing some of the things that, people are creating, like the cell chips like that can test the different um drugs and see their reactions. So I guess could you talk a little bit more then about sort of what is like the state of animal research today? I know you've mentioned to me before that the current administration is actually making some changes to things, but like you write in the book a bit about how like dog catchers used to pick up stray dogs in neighborhoods that were people's pets and sell them to labs for testing. Like, does that still happen? What are things like now in 2026?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I have not heard stories like that. That's the whole reason that the Animal Welfare Act was passed in 1966, because that's exactly what happened. The labs would go out and sometimes steal dogs from people's backyards, which, I think about Hammy coming from a lab to a home. I mean, imagine these pets that went from a home to a lab. And I mean, yeah, it's all awful to think about. So that's the good news. But what that meant is that instead of getting street dogs and backyard dogs, it spawned an industry of breeding beagles like on a really industrial level. So when I started reporting, there were three massive beagle breeders. One had 5,000 beagles, another had 3,000 beagles, and the biggest one in upstate New York had sometimes over 20,000 beagles, which, right, can't even imagine that many beagles.
No.
Um, and so they breed them and they sell them to the labs. And when I adopted Hammy, there were 70,000 dogs in labs that year. And in 2024, there were 40,000. So that's partly because one of the big breeders was shut down. And that's a story I tell in the book. And also, we might be moving away from dogs. In some cases, people are replacing dogs with pigs because pigs tend to be a more acceptable animal to do research on. But the better story is if we can move away from these feeling, thinking, sentient animals altogether and use some of the other methods like you were talking about, like the organ chip and AI, computer modeling. There's just a lot of really cool technologies out there. And like you said, this administration has been talking about doing more of that. The NIH and FDA and EPA are all making announcements about how they're going to use more of the non-animal methods. And so this is all really encouraging.
That's really yeah, that's good to know those numbers. And also you mentioned this a little bit before too, but if people, I mean, I texted you when I first started reading your book and I was like, I'm going to adopt a beagle next and like, I'm like going to be a vegan by the time I finish reading your book, but if people, are moved by reading Lab Dog, which I would be shocked if they're not, what are some ways that people can, um, at least not maybe actively contribute to supporting animal testing, but I guess what are some things like, you said you think about every single product when you buy it and you think about Hammy, but what are some other things that us, you know, animal enthusiasts can do?
Yeah, well, definitely adopting a beagle used in research would be a great start. But there's only so many of them. A very small fraction of them get out, or a small number of them get out. I always tell people, of course, read Lab Dog and educate yourself because a lot of people still don't know this is happening, and that includes our lawmakers. So write letters to your legislators, let them know that you don't want dog breeding facilities in your state, you don't want dog experiments in your state, you'd like more funding to go to the non-animal methods. And also follow the groups that are really working on this, like Humane World for Animals, PETA, Rise for Animals. They all have, great newsletters, and you can kind of follow what's happening in different states. And the other thing is just really into what you're purchasing, and help spread the word. I mean, make sure that people know, because as consumers and voters, if we don't know, we can't make change. So
Thank you. That's really
thanks
important.
for yeah, thanks for asking that question.
Of course. So,
So are you oh, go ahead.
well, no, I mean, this is, I guess, a little bit of a transition into my book too. But so Hammy was the reason why you kind of dove into this topic. And I also really loved how you used Hammy's life as sort of, the narrative arc in a lot of ways of the story. And I think there's a lot of grief in your book as well, right? About, what happened to him, grieving his kind of lost early years that were spent in a lab. And then, grief that he's getting old and he has a diagnosis in the book that's upsetting and that kind of thing. And I guess what was it like for you to write about Hammy and his life in this way throughout the book?
Yeah, well, I know I'm looking forward to having talking about this with you because you are the expert on pet death. And I ended up reading your book after I lost Hammy, and it was really comforting at that time. Hammy and I had a full decade together, and I lost him when he was 14, and I was in the middle of writing this manuscript. And I just remember, I had to take some time and just stop everything else and spend every moment with him. We had a great last week or two and did everything that he wanted to do. He ate what he got to eat, wanted to eat. And, it was just a really sweet, special time. So writing about that afterwards was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Just really paying attention to how I was feeling and grieving. And I'm sure that helped the process, but it just, it didn't make it easier. It's just painful, right? I mean, it really hurts for a long time. And now I'm just thankful I get to tell his story and talk about him a lot. So
That's great. Well, I'm glad he
yeah.
lives on in Lab Dog and what a legend. He has a whole book written about him.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a good transition to talk about good grief. And I guess I'm curious. I mean, I loved your book as well, and
Yeah.
I'm curious about what brought you to this topic in the beginning. I mean, we all deal with death in our lives from, humans and pets, and there's just something really special about losing pets in our lives. And, you've taken it on, which was a big challenge.
Thanks. Yeah, I know. I do sometimes feel like taking it on is like the right phrase for it because It is a heavy topic. I mean, like I say this in my book, but there's a whole website called Does the Dog Die? Because people are get so upset often when like a dog or a cat dies in a movie that you can look up the movie and see like, okay, a dog is injured but doesn't die or like that kind of thing. But I was drawn to the subject just in part because like I grew up with a lot of animals, and I mean maybe someone in this chat knows how, but I haven't figured out how to make them live forever yet. So, if you have a lot of pets, like you usually outlive them. I mean, I do write in the book about instances of when pets outlive their people, and how that is challenging in its own way. But for the most part, like you get a pet, you love this pet, you invest your heart and soul into this animal for a decade, and then you lose them. And I was drawn to it because I'd gone through this so often. And also part of me was like, why do we do this to ourselves? Like nobody is putting a gun to your head and saying, like, you have to get a puppy, like this is a choice that we often make. I mean, I talked to many parents for this book who said, they would argue that sometimes maybe their kids did force them to get pets that then they fell in love with, and then they were devastated when the pets died. But for the most part, we're deciding to bring these animals and have these relationships. And, even though they're so, so upsetting, when we lose our pets, there must be something really special about our relationships with animals. Otherwise, why would we keep doing it? And, I interviewed a lot of people who have had pets over their lives for my book. And like I can count on one hand the people who said it was too hard after my pet died. I couldn't do it again. Most people usually
Mm.
take some time, grieve, mourn however they need to, and then open their heart again to another animal.
Well, and why is pet grieving so much harder or so different from grieving for a human?
Yeah, so um I think it's really because our relationships with our pets is so different. You know, you can love a person, but you can have a really complicated relationship with a person who you love. You can get frustrated with them and angry with them about things. You can have all this resentment maybe from things that happened 50 years ago. And then also sometimes like with people, like you can become their caretakers for a long time if they're sick. And when someone dies, you can often feel grief and sadness that they're gone. You can also feel relief. You can also feel anger. And I feel like though our relationships with our pets are just often so much more pure. Like you don't have an animal, holding a grudge, like you don't not speak to your own cat for, a year or something like that. And so I think that, when those pets die, it's really hard because it's just this like purely devastating loss as opposed to like the more complicated human to human loss. And I mean also just there are studies too about how our pets, physically like petting them and touching them and cuddling with them, releases, like oxytocin in your brain and makes you feel good. And we often don't have those physical connections with very many other humans, like maybe your partner, maybe your kid, or like if your kid is little, right? Then they become a teenager and they don't want you to hug them anymore. But so I think like that kind of intimate, relationship is very special. And then also just the fact that, you see your pet every day, you might spend the most time with your pet than any other person, and they might sleep in your bed, they sit on the couch with you every night. A lot of older people I interviewed for the book said, most of my family lives far away, my kids are all grown up, like it's me and my dog, and so
Mm.
to lose that relationship, and really how they structure our day-to-day lives is really, really profound. I had a friend who said that when his dog died and he works from home, 3 days went by and he realized he hadn't left the house because he was just so used to going out when, she needed a walk. And then all of a sudden his whole routine was different.
Oh, yeah, no, I definitely relate to that. I remember after I lost Hammy, same thing. I mean, I work at home and I was like, I had to take myself out for a walk.
Yeah.
because I was just used to doing this many times a day with Hammy, and it's like, no, I gotta get out of the house. I also feel like it's sometimes part of our identity. I mean, I was a travel writer who got in the car with my beagle and we drove cross country, and that's what we did. And then, my beagle buddy wasn't there anymore. So it's really just such a huge loss. Um, so you write about a lot of different pets. I've always had dogs, but I have to tell you, I was looking recently, there's a organization called Save the Buns that gets bunnies out of
Oh.
research. And they're actually based in Connecticut. And I was like, what would it be like to adopt a bunny? So, but what's the process, the mourning process like for other animals? Is it any different? And you've experienced, it seems like, quite a menagerie of them.
Yeah, well, I really wanted to make a point in the book to not just write about dogs and cats, even though like I easily could have written this book just about dogs or just about cats. Like so many people have relationships with those animals. But I wanted to show that really it doesn't matter the species of the pet if the person has a relationship with the animal and a connection with the animal. When that animal dies, they're going to be just as upset, going through the same kind of grief, as somebody else would with a different kind of animal. So somebody who has had a lot of dogs is going to be really upset when their dogs die, and somebody who maybe is like really into iguanas is going to be devastated when their iguana dies. Um, and it's interesting, as somebody who's had a lot of different species of animals, I will say some of the deaths hit me harder than others. And I think for me, at least, speaking from my own experience, it often just had to do with the amount of time. Um, so like my two dogs who I write about, childhood dogs who I write about in the last chapter of the book, collectively they were part of my life, for almost 20 years. And they saw me through middle school, high school, college, grad school, like adult jobs and all this stuff. And they were there and with me for the majority of my life. And so their deaths really hit super hard. While, I had a whole bunch of different like zebra finches at one point who, I had for a couple months and I was really upset in the moment, when they died, but it didn't hit me quite in the same way. Um, I will say though, often, um, animals like pets can die in very sudden and actually often very violent and upsetting ways, and I think that can also can contribute to why pet loss is so upsetting. And so I think that sometimes, like I can't tell you how many parents told me stories about like vacuuming up a gerbil or a hamster that belonged to their kid, and just like awful, awful things like that, or backing over a puppy. And I think often a pet death can also hit really hard depending on sort of how the death happens. And with animals, with pets, when you get a pet, it's this responsibility, and you're entering a contract with this animal that says, I'm going to care for you for the rest of your life. And like our parents when we're young and we ask for pets, drill it into your head like a pet's a big responsibility, like they need to go for walks, you need to feed them, like all this stuff. And so I think, that responsibility really weighs on people when their animal dies. And so I think, even if an animal is sick and dying and it's just the end of their natural life, people feel a lot of responsibility and guilt when their pet dies. And definitely, I find people who I spoke with who had a situation where they felt somehow responsible for their pet's death, I think often really grieved them much harder when they felt either, oh, I should have noticed that my cat wasn't eating and that she had cancer. Or I write about this in the book, but one woman I interviewed, she didn't notice her parrot had climbed up on a chair and bumped into him when she was holding a laundry basket, and he got injured, and then he never really recovered from that and died. And like those things, I think can often make it doesn't matter the species, that kind of loss is really hard.
Yeah, I've had that conversation with my friends about the a very fast death versus something that's slow. I mean, and in Hammy's case, I knew about, he had a little mass that grew very slowly, but that meant for years I was wondering, well, is this the month? Is this the month? Is it going to grow really quickly now? And I was super lucky to have a couple years after his diagnosis, but then I have plenty of other friends, and cancer is so common in dogs who their dogs are doing great until one day they're not, and the cancer they find out has just spread everywhere, and it's literally like days or a week after that. So, I don't know. It's impossible to say like, oh, it's better this way or this way because it's all
Yeah.
just hard, but it's just it's a very different process every time.
Well,
And
Well, I just
okay.
one of the things I learned from some of the vets I interviewed was like, animals have evolved, through biology to hide illness, because that would make them vulnerable as, to predators in the wild. So to not beat yourself up if you didn't notice that your dog was acting weird or had cancer or whatever it was, because they were intentionally hiding that, because that's how they have evolved to be. So that was reassuring in a way to know that, you know, it's not your fault if you didn't notice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I have two questions. At first, I want to know, um, people just never know the right thing to say when they're talking to somebody who's lost someone. So I want to know what you learned about that and if you have any suggestions. And then I just thought we both could talk about what we did personally to kind of deal with that grief. So,
Yeah, and also writing about pretty heavy topics, and like I was writing about pets mostly who had died 10 plus years, before I was writing my book. But you were living Hammy's death, while you were working on it. But
mm,
for your first question, I get this question a lot too. People will ask, is there something special that you should do when someone's pet dies? And I mean, my first piece of advice I think applies to all death, not just animal death, but don't be afraid to talk about it with people. And I will say, like, as a culture, I feel like Americans are like super death phobic, nervous about talking about death. When I would mention what my book was about, I had more than one friend who would make a joke that was like, "Oh, I'll never need your book because my cat's gonna live forever." Haha. And I'm like, I don't think you're 100% joking, Um, so don't be afraid to talk about it. I mean, don't force the person to talk about it, but make it clear, if you want to talk, I'm here, I'll listen. If your friend wants to cry and beat themselves up for, not, getting the chemo or, whatever surgery that maybe could have helped, listen. So I think just making yourself available and listening. Um, and the other thing is just, treat it like you would any other death. So, I mean, think about what you would do for a friend if you found out her mom died and do something similar, right? Like go to the grocery store, get a bag of, basic groceries and drop them off, or send a sympathy note, or, just leave a voice message and say, I'm here if you want to talk. Um, and also, sorry, getting over a cold. You know, remembering too that it's not just okay, 2 weeks after the death, after that you're done, you don't have to follow up. But it's really nice sometimes if you can check in, if you remember like, oh, Hammy's gotcha day was this day. It would be good if I texted, Melanie and said I was thinking of her on that day. Or um like I have friends who had a really hard time at Christmas because their cat would always climb up in the tree and play with the ornaments. So like they thought they were doing better with their cat's death, and then the holidays came around and all of a sudden it hit them all over again. So, remembering that anniversaries and holidays and things like that can be a difficult time, and I guess following up. And also just never ask when they're going to get another pet. Like that's like the shittiest thing. Don't ask that. But I guess Melanie, can you speak a bit about what we were talking about before, like writing about Hammy and grieving him kind of at the same time, and I'm sure that was extremely hard, but you said it was also felt sort of cathartic or helpful.
Yeah, the writing just forced me to have it really, it was just in front of me all the time. I couldn't ignore it. And that probably was good because there were a lot of tears, and there's a few sections of the book that every time I went through to edit it and proofread it, I would cry all over again. And I think there was something that felt good about that because I kind of felt like if I was still crying, he felt closer.
Mhm.
That the grieving for him just felt like that experience of having him and losing him was closer. And even though it was sad, it did feel good too. Um, we just had so many great times and experiences together. And after I lost him, I forced myself not just to go out and take myself for a walk, but really just to go out and keep adventuring because when we were together, I would deliberately take us on adventures, whether it was a long road trip or to a new park. I mean, during the pandemic, we went to 80 different parks in 80 days
Oh,
around DC, Maryland, Virginia. Some were like little tiny parks, some were national parks. And, he liked sniffing out new places. And after I lost him, I realized, oh, I like that too. So I have to keep doing that for myself. And so that would make me think of him and just in the spirit of Hammy, keep sniffing out new spots.
that's great.
So what do you do to help get through the grieving process?
I mean, definitely writing about stuff. I've always been a big journal keeper, and so, writing about feelings is very helpful. And I find just giving yourself like time and place to reflect and remember, or like you said, do things in honor of your pet, right? Like go for walks, visit places they like to visit. Think about them when you're in those spots, right? Like my childhood dog Gus loved to go fishing with my dad, and so we cremated his ashes and we spread them kind of in the spot where they would go fishing. And every time like I'm near that spot, I think of him and I kind of like say hi to him, and giving yourself those spaces and time for that. And even if it's just like going through photos on your phone to pick out 10 pictures to do an Instagram, tribute post, that stuff can really, I think, help you move through. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that also, like you said, we want to have our friends talk about who we've lost. And so whenever people say, "Oh, remember when Hammy did this?" or, my friends who knew Hammy, it makes me happy to have that connection with them. We traveled a lot and stayed in friends' homes, and he just made an impression on everybody because he was just himself. And so, it's nice to kind of share those memories with friends and have that connection and just, like you said, keep talking about them.
Totally. And I think, sorry, I thought I was over this. I think actually a really beautiful thing about social media is that people can get to know each other's pets in a way that previously, your cat was in your house and like, I don't know, maybe your neighbor knew your cat a little bit, but not in the same way that people share photos and stories. And I think then people are aware of what you're going through. Sorry. And then can reach out when they know that you're struggling. And my friend Annie Hartnett, who writes great novels about animals, when her dog Harvey was dying, like she was posting about it on Facebook, and she said that when he died, she got like dozens of sympathy cards because people knew what she was going through because she was sharing. Um, but yeah, I love getting to talk to people who knew my pets too and reminisce with them and share those memories. And it feels like it keeps them alive, just the same way you do with people.
Yeah, no, to your point about sharing this with people, it's I approached Hammy's death very differently than the death of my first beagle, Darwin, because after that, I went to a place where nobody knew where I was. I mean, I physically like went there and I locked myself in a room and I didn't come out and I didn't want to see any of my dog friends for many weeks. And I just felt like I couldn't talk about it. And I didn't want to see other people with dogs. I really isolated myself. And this time I did share. I wrote an article, I wrote an essay for Washingtonian about losing Hammy. And I wrote about him in my newsletter. And then of course I wrote about him in the book. And it's like, oh, this community of people that I know and people who loved Hammy, they care about me now because I'm hurting and they're hurting too because we've all lost him. And it just was a very different grieving process. It was nice. It was comforting.
Yeah, and I really like I've become close to friends over, my life because they were there for me when a pet died or I was there for them or um like just writing good grief. Like people come up to me at book events all the time and want to share their stories of loss and tell me about their pets and I want to tell them about mine and it's when you find people who really understand, it's really wonderful. So I think it's good not to isolate yourself and kind of put yourself out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
The other thing too, that I wanted to mention that's another sort of special way I think that's unique maybe to grieving an animal is I write about euthanasia a lot in the book because that is something that's often different with a pet death, and can contribute to a lot of the guilt and tension and stress around it because often you are deciding, when your pet's life um, should end. But something that I think is actually really beautiful about it is if you're planning for it and it's scheduled. I know several people who have thrown parties, sort of like end of life celebrations for their animals, like on the night before. And, an open house, people can come through and give them treats and say goodbye and give a hug. And I think that's such a beautiful thing that you can do that is pretty unique to having a pet. And, um, I love that sort of physical embodiment of the community of people who love your animal, showing up in that way.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. I loved reading about that in your book. So,
Thank you.
so I think we can turn to audience questions now.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. Folks, if you have questions, now is the time to get them into the Q&A. You can also use the chat, but I'm going to primarily focus on the Q&A. Okay, and I'm going to ask them initially. I'm going to go in chronological order. So these first few are going to be for Melanie. So EB, grab a glass of water, EB. I hope you're okay. Okay, all right. So Catherine wants to know, Melanie, do you have a new dog? You're such a great dog mom, so I hope you do.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. I do not, but I did foster a little pregnant mom who was found in rural Virginia. And I had her in my house for 2 days, and then she gave birth to three puppies. So I got to have the puppies in my house for a few weeks until I went out of town, and then another foster took over. But that was really pretty amazing seeing her take care of the puppies, and just awesome to have them at home.
So two-part question from Ellen. Ellen asks Melanie, how can lovers adopt dogs that are currently in labs? And then she asks, for what specific reasons do labs release dogs for adoption?
Good question. Well, I'll answer the second part first. Usually, most of them are not fit to be adopted out. So the ones that are adopted out might be used as controls, they might be breeders, or they've been part of a study that's non-invasive. But more than 90% are usually euthanized because they have to study the tissues and the organs. And there's a number of organizations out there that are working to get these dogs out of labs and then adopt them out. There's one called Be Freegal. There's Kindness Ranch, which is a sanctuary in Wyoming. There's the Beagle Alliance in Canada. And if you are interested in adopting one, feel free to reach out to me. My email's on my website and I can help connect you.
Excellent. Okay, I think we answered both those. Another one. How, as a journalist and author, were you able to sublimate the moments that felt heartbreaking? How you coped through the part to get the story done?
Hmm. I had to take a lot of breaks, and Hammy was a really good therapy dog. And in a lot of ways, once I had my journalist hat on, I just felt like I had to tell this story. And so I pushed through a lot of the hard stuff. And then when I turned to writing, I had to figure out what not to include because there is a whole vast amount of material I didn't put in there. And we don't need to know everything. We don't need to know every detail. And I didn't want this to be a miserable book to read. I wanted it to be, a love story between Hammy and me, and then an investigation on his past. And so so yeah, a lot of it was tough. I had to read a lot of hard things to understand for myself what was happening.
And Melanie, Kathleen asks, how do you find out if products are or are not tested on animals?
There are a couple really good lists. PETA keeps a list of products that aren't tested on animals. And then there's the Leaping Bunny program. So when you go to the store, you can look at a product. It'll either have the Leaping Bunny logo or it'll say not tested on animals on it. But these two lists online are really good guides. And again, you can email me if you can't find those resources.
All right. Let's include EB here. So Catherine asks, EB, can you talk a bit about how many people's first experience of a death is a pet? Mine was a goldfish when I was about 3.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for asking that and for sharing. I think yeah, a lot of people, their first experience of death is losing a pet. I read some work by child psychologists who said the three most traumatic events that usually happen in a child's life, usually in order, is the death of a pet, the death of a grandparent, and then usually a move, like from a house. And that's of course assuming, other kids have gone through much worse trauma when they're younger, but when the first experience of death as a pet, it can be really hard for a kid for a number of reasons, right? Like depending on how old the child is, just understanding the concept of death and understanding that, okay, my animal friend is not coming back, a lot of little kids often will ask about like, oh, when they wake up, or like, are they sleeping? And a lot of people I spoke with said, it's really important to use direct, clear language. Like try not to use euphemisms when talking to kids, saying your pet died and not saying, they passed away or they're sleeping. Like those things can actually be harder for kids to kind of understand. Um, and then also as kids get older, sometimes they'll have more like technical questions, honestly, about like decomposition or, what actually happens to my animal's body or their soul or their spirit. And, how a parent answers those questions depends often on, the family's beliefs and their culture and their religion. Um, but those are all hard things for kids to wrap their heads around too. But something that I thought was really interesting when I was reading a lot about grief, is that, part of why grief is such a challenging emotion is it always, anytime you're experiencing grief, it's reminding you of every other time in your life you've experienced grief, right? So, you're sitting at your grandmother's funeral, but it's reminding you of your aunt's funeral, which reminded you of the kid who lived next door who passed away suddenly. Like it's all these things wrapped together. And it's sort of funny because when I think about it, it's like Matryoshka nesting dolls. And at the center of it all is probably that goldfish death, that started it all. But I think just with kids experiencing death for the first time, just trying to use clear language, answer their questions, even if they seem difficult. And also not being afraid to show that you're sad too. I mean, for me as a kid, seeing my parents get upset, when we had to put our dogs down, like that was really powerful for me to know, like, okay, it's okay to love an animal and be upset about their death.
Another anonymous question. This one goes to EB. Do you find non-pet people are less sympathetic about the death of someone's pet?
That's a great question. Sometimes yes, like to be perfectly frank, and I think it's just because they haven't experienced it. And one of my best friends from high school, like I love her to death, and she grew up with a cat, but the cat was very much her sister's cat, and she just, I don't know, she just didn't really understand sort of what the fuss was. And she actually came with me. We were in Paris together. She came with me to the pet cemetery in Paris that I visited. And it was mind blowing for her because she was like, wow, people really love their pets a lot, huh? That they like spend all this money and time making these beautiful monuments. And I was like, yeah, like people grieve their pets like they grieve humans. And it was funny because I could like see something like click for her in that moment. Um, but I do think it can be hard often just to relate to something that you don't know about, right? Like if your friend loses a parent and you've never lost a parent, like you can do your best to be, empathetic and caring and think about their loss because of other losses you've experienced, but you haven't maybe directly been in their shoes. So I think that non-pet people can have the capacity to be caring and understanding, if they've experienced losses in their own life. But I think sometimes they might misstep more easily and ask, like, well, I saw like the MSPCA is a whole bunch of kittens. Why don't you just head down and get another one? So be kind to them. They don't know what they're missing by not having pets.
So I have about a handful of comments that we may not get to all of them, but I'm going to read them here from some of the audience, and then you both can respond. Evie, these might be more up your alley, but Melanie, feel free to respond as well. So an anonymous attendee writes, I am a volunteer adoption counselor for an animal rescue, and almost every time I screen people, they have recently lost a dog. I never know exactly what to say, and people really want to talk with a fellow animal lover. So any response there, EB?
I mean, I think just saying, that you've been through it as a fellow animal lover, you get that it's hard. And then just really giving them the space to listen. I feel like often that's all people actually really want is just someone to say, like, I've been there, I get it. Like, tell me more about your dog. Like, what was so amazing about your dog? At least in my experience, they don't necessarily need like a prescriptive advice. They just want someone to listen.
Sure. So Krista writes, my dog who passed a few years ago loved lettuce. He would always beg for it and came running when I would open the crisper. Just a couple of months ago, about 3 years after he passed, I dropped some lettuce on the ground while cooking, and when it was still there a few minutes later, I broke down in tears. I felt ridiculous afterwards, but then it just reminded me that grief has no timeline. Any thoughts
I
there,
get
EB?
that.
Yeah,
Yeah, hard relate. There's been so
totally.
many times when I've dropped a crumb or just something on the floor and there's no one to pick it up and it just like crushes me. Still, 2+ years later, I get that.
So Don writes, I have used EB's book, Good Grief, on several occasions as gifts to friends who have lost a loved pet. It is a lovely book, and I thank you for writing it.
Oh, thank you, Dawn, and thank you for giving it to people. My hope was that it would be a nice thing that people could give to a friend who's in need.
So final question is going to go here from MD. Uh, and I'm not sure exactly. This might be up both your alleys. MD asks, what about pets when their owners pass away? How does one handle this situation? Who will take care of the pet afterwards? Is there any legalities with situations such as this?
Well, you
Yeah.
probably know more about this than I do, but I will just say that the little mama dog that I just fostered is getting adopted by a woman. I think that she's in her 60s, and I was told that she has an agreement with, and I will say 60s is so young, but she has an agreement with a couple of friends that, whoever, if somebody goes, one of the humans dies, then the other friends will take care of the dogs, which I just thought was such a nice arrangement. And of course, there's legal ways to do this in your will too. But Evie, you might know more about this.
Well, I love that. And I mean, I was going to say that, having a serious conversation with somebody about, if I die, will you take my pet? Like, don't just assume that someone will because they love you. And in particular, I have two tortoises who can live anywhere from 20 to 60 years. And so, like, my niece, who's a teenager, like, I've been like, Agnes, do you actually want to take these tortoises one day? Like, if they weigh out, live me. Um, but yeah, you should actually name in your will often, if you have animals, at least somebody to facilitate their care. So, like, even if they can't necessarily take over, ownership of your dog, they can at least help place the dog in a new home. You also can't, so in the law, animals are technically humans' property, so you cannot directly leave things to your pet, but you can set up a trust that the money from the trust is supposed to be used for your dog's care after your death. And then you can appoint a person to be the trustee of that, who then can withdraw money for the animal's vet bills or food or whatever it is. Like there, Karl Lagerfeld, I believe, left like a huge trust for his cat, if I'm remembering correctly. So there are ways for that too. But yeah, don't just assume like people will figure it out after I'm gone. Like those are animals who rely on you, and make sure that you actually have things set up to assist with their care afterwards.
All right, so we're going to start to wind things up, or wrap things up, I should say. So I will circle back to both of you with one quick last question. But first, let's give a big virtual round of applause for EB and Melanie for a wonderful conversation and Q&A. Look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording. I'll also put links to a local bookstore that will ship you their books if you want to purchase, as well as their website and socials. Okay, so my final question. And I didn't even mention this at the beginning, EB. So EB's book, Good Grief, came out a few years ago, but it just recently became available in paperback. Okay, and then Melanie's book, Lab Dog, just came out less than 6 months ago. So these are hot off the press, brand new books here. So EB and Melanie, what is next for you? Are you working on any new book projects or anything else you want the audience to know about before we wrap up?
You want to go first?
Sure. I don't have anything official yet. I have a 2-year-old human child in my care now. So I'm a little busy being a mom, but I am actually trying to work on writing a version of Good Grief for a younger audience, because I've gotten a lot of parents asking me for advice for kids when they're going through grieving a pet. And so I think that there's a lot of valuable information in there that middle grade readers would appreciate. So that's something I'm working on, though right now it's more like a theoretical idea until
Sure.
maybe my kid's a little older.
And
Melanie, what about
I
you?
am, yeah, I'm still kind of all lab dog all the time. And I'm actually in New England right now on a book tour. I'm going to be in Portland, Maine on Friday night. And then EB and I are doing an event in at Newtonville Books Tuesday night. I'm
Great.
at Amherst Books Monday night and Jamaica Plain on Wednesday. So yeah, if you're in the area, come see us, and hope to meet some of you soon.
And don't forget,
Excellent.
there'll be beagles at the event in Newton.
Yes, all the events will be beagles.
Wonderful. Oh, good to know. Excellent. Well, I'll include your website in the follow-up email, and folks can click on there and see. It's great that you're in our neck of the woods. I think some of the folks online may, who watch the recording, may come out and see you. So thank you all so much. Wonderful job, EB and Melanie. And look for that email tomorrow. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. And go Patriots. Okay. So thank you all. Have a great night. Bye bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Robert.
Robert.